It's easy to remember Hell's Paradise for its vivid imagery of flower monsters and lustful, almost gods, often overlooking the elements that make it one of the most historically and religiously dense stories of recent shonen. For example, did you know that the real-life Yamada Asaemon clan actually wrote a book on how to rank a katana's sharpness? Or that the creator of the Tensen is inspired by an actual real-life historical figure? Or that Hell's Paradise power system is deeply steeped in 2000-year-old Taoist philosophy? And they all fit nicely together. So today, I'm breaking down the history, religion, and philosophy that help build the mesmerizing world of Jigokuraku. Let's start this off with a spotlight on our protagonist, Gabimaru, the shinobi. People might be more familiar with the more modern term ninja, but Jigokuraku uses the older historical term, shinobi, a person who conceals, hides, but also a person who endures. While the real-life shinobi were more intelligence operatives rather than assassins, the name of his profession is actually symbolic of Gabimaru's character. The kanji for shinobi is built of two radicals, a sword placed over a heart. But more on thematic symbolism later. Now, let's stop for a moment to look at where the real-world shinobi came from. While there is still some debate about the origins of the ninja, all historians tie them primarily to two regions in Japan, Iga and Koka. Iga is a territory that sits protected by mountains, which, for a great part of its history, evaded domination from a powerful feudal lord. And because of that, something unusual grew there. A network of self-governing mountain villages that managed their own defense, trained their own warriors, and operated under their own law. A place where families trained their children from birth in what will later be called ninjutsu. Does that sound familiar? It's hard not to notice the parallel with Gabimaru's hidden rock village, Iwagakure. These historical Iga villages probably operated on a clan structure, much like in the anime, with the chief, the jonin, at the top. He was the one who took contracts, negotiated with warlords, made decisions, while the lower ranks, the genin, were kept deliberately ignorant of who the jonin was. It's a classic way to protect leadership from the pitfalls of information being divulged. Historically, there was a man who embodied this idea of untouchable leadership perfectly, Momochi Sandayu. He was said to have maintained 3 separate households, families, with 3 different identities. When Oda Nobunaga invaded Iga in a brutal campaign that nearly destroyed the province, Momochi simply vanished. Later Edo period stories would create legends about his escape and even his immortality. Kind of similar to how the chief of Iwagakure in Hell's Paradise holds control over his shinobi not just through force, but by projecting an aura of mythical invincibility. In fact, Gabimaru the Hollow being an invented identity meant to attach a legend of immortality to the name, works exactly in the same way. Deliberate myth-making, both directed at your own people and at outsiders, seems to be in line with documented shinobi tradition. The Bansenshukai, a 17th century ninjutsu encyclopedia, actually documents such practices as spreading rumors, cultivating fear, and manufacturing reputation. The shinobi who appeared supernatural was usually a shinobi who worked very hard to appear supernatural. And what of Gabimaru's superhuman resistance or ability to create fire? Surely there's no basis in reality to that. Well, do real mystical traditions count? There exists a group of people that lives, among other places, in the mountains of Iga, the Yamabushi. These were ascetic practitioners of a tradition called Shugendo, a blend of Shinto, Buddhism, and Taoist philosophy, kind of like much of the symbolic imagery of Hell's Paradise. What did Shugendo training look like? Standing in freezing waterfalls, fasting for days, walking on hot coals. It was believed that if you trained your body hard enough, you could do things that looked impossible to anyone watching. This extreme ascetic training, the brutality of it, the way it is framed as a process of hollowing out the self, is very much in line with what we see of Gabimaru's training. His nickname the Hollow, his technique called ascetic blaze, these are all references to powerful inner discipline, which is exactly how Shugendo practitioners would have understood it. This aligns very well with the story's representation of the world, which is heavily influenced by Taoist understanding of the universe. But we'll dive deeper into that a little later. For now, I'll end the section about the shinobi by highlighting that, despite their image of covert spies, assassins for hire, there are historical sources that reference their ethics, including statements that inner virtue and will are the foundation of all shinobi ability. One of the very first sections of the Bansenshukai contains this almost meditative line: "The heart is the foundation of all things." Now that we've looked at the foundations of Gabimaru's background, let's turn our attention to Sagiri, our deuteragonist. Yamada Asaemon is not a family name, but more of a title held by the semi-official sword testers, executioners, for the last 150 years of the Edo period, give or take. They truly existed, and as in the anime and manga, the title could be passed to adopted successors, not only to blood family. The relationship between the Yamada and the shogunate was, complicated. We could say it was one of the ironies of this period in Japanese history. They were, at the same time, indispensable, but also were required to not be too visible. Every time a high-ranking samurai needed a sword certified, or a criminal needed beheading, it was the Yamada Asaemon who were called, since they were the ones who possessed the extraordinary skills needed for a clean and efficient job. But you see, they were considered Ronin, samurai without a master, and because of this, they were not given the respect or compensation afforded the samurai. And fun fact, the main part of that compensation was a stipend of rice. Yes, that's why no one thinks I'm fun at parties. Anyway, going back to the Yamada, the way one historian put it, they possessed the indecorous position of unofficial executioners at Edo. This is evident in Hell's Paradise as well, where we can see different officials looking down on members of the clan, but also at times affording them a sort of begrudging acceptance due to need. The problem was, while death was a constant fact readily accepted in Edo period Japan, occupations involving it, not just executioners but also butchers and anything related to handling of corpses, were seen as impure. As a result, those involved were treated a bit like outcasts. The shogunate and society overall needed the work done, but they despised those who did it. In many ways, in this regard, they resemble a bit the shinobi, and Hell's Paradise captures that quite well. It's partly why the connection between Gabimaru and Sagiri is so symbolic. In fact, the story is not subtle in its criticism of such social structures, with Shion often remarking in disappointment that it is the era, and not merit or justice, that decides how things are. And speaking of merit, Jigokuraku does a good job of highlighting the skills an Yamada Asaemon would have to develop in order to perform their job, well, excluding the supernatural bits. As you might expect, though hopefully not think about often, beheading is not a clean affair. The human neck is pretty complex: muscles, ligaments, vertebrae, all things that would create significant resistance. It is why members of the clan would develop anatomical knowledge and understanding of the mechanics of how different cuts travel through bone. So Fuchi's character from Hell's Paradise is probably not too quirky a representation of an actual Asaemon. In fact, their manuals, which contain detailed diagrams of cut zones and body positioning, were described by one historian as a fascinating, if queasy, catalogue of the body's vulnerabilities. Fuchi is representative of another occupation the historical Yamada Asaemon participated in: medicine making. See, when the shogun doesn't want to recognize your position and compensate it accordingly, you have to be creative and develop additional revenue sources. During this historical period, human organs were believed to carry strong medical properties, and when the Yamada did not receive the usual rice income, they did have access to a high supply of corpses. From these corpses, they extracted liver, brain, and bile and incorporated them into pills sold throughout the country. There is some irony here. The public, which found the act of handling corpses vile, had no problem using the results of this kind of work. Though I guess you could say they weren't totally undiscerning, only male corpses were used. Women and commoners with disabilities, they were seen as inappropriate. Despite all this other business, the Yamada's main occupation was, in fact, testing the sharpness and quality of a sword, otherwise known as Tameshigiri. The process was, I feel, quite interesting, but since it has little thematic implication for the story of Hell's Paradise, you can easily skip the next segment. For those of you still with me, let's go over what Tameshigiri involved. For a bit of context, a sword's quality required a certain certification, a rating basically, which was engraved on the handle. It was actually Yamada who officially codified the 4 ratings that determined a katana's value and prestige in his book Kaiho Kenjaku. At the time, only 12 blades in existence were said to have achieved the top grade. The cuts for this certification had some technical precision, even though it wouldn't actually be Sunday morning family viewing material. The body of an executed criminal was immobilized by being staked in 4 corners, and cuts in primarily 4 target zones were made on it. Near the clavicle, the hardest to cut, armpit area, the chest near the ribs, and diagonal from shoulders through the chest. Sometimes the smith whose sword was being tested attended in a ceremonial white kimono, ready to commit seppuku on the spot if the blade failed. This rarely happened, thankfully, but there is something to be said about the theatrical seriousness of the process. Speaking of theatrics, I wonder about the famous blade that cut through 7 corpses at once. Would have loved to see that test. Very brief pause just to remind you that if you enjoyed this kind of video, there's the little subscribe button below that could help you get notified when I post new content and also help me grow overall. Either way, thank you for being here, and now let's get back to our analysis. With this general view of the historical background of our main cast, let's turn our attention to their objective, the Elixir of Life. The search for a mythical substance capable of granting immortality is a theme that can be found among different cultures from different periods. In order to find the one relevant to Hell's Paradise, we would have to go back about 2,200 years to recently unified China. The then Chinese Emperor, Qin Shi Huang, actually the first Chinese emperor, had been obsessed with achieving immortality at all costs. For this goal, he sent out his court sorcerer, Shu Fu, though the Chinese would have called him a Fangshi, on an expedition to find the legendary Mount Penlai and retrieve the elixir from the immortals said to have been living there. If the name Shu Fu doesn't ring any bells, I'm sure the Japanese version will. Chufuku. Yes, the name of the master and supposed creator of Hell's Paradise Shinsenkyo. And when I call Shu Fu a sorcerer, do not think of wands or summoning magical creatures. The Fangshi were experimental philosophers and occult technicians, with expertise in fields such as astronomy, astrology, divination, medicine and healing, alchemy and longevity practices. Yes, including sexual ones. All occupations familiar to those living on Hell's Paradise's island. Since we're here, I think it's worth going a bit into the story of Shu Fu's expedition. It is said that Shu Fu was sent out with a fleet carrying thousands of virgin boys and girls to retrieve the Elixir of Life from the immortals on the mythical Mount Penlai. What this fleet didn't carry, apparently, were weapons, supposedly because those might scare off the immortals. After sailing for a couple of years and not finding the mountain, our cult alchemist returned, claiming there was a giant sea creature blocking the path. The Qin Emperor sent archers who apparently killed the giant fish, and Shu Fu was once again sent on his expedition. Not long after this second departure, the Chinese emperor died at the age of 50. As an ironic twist of fate, there is speculation that it is his quest for immortality that killed him, specifically that he ingested mercury in an attempt to expand his life. As an aside, for fans of Kingdom, this emperor is the one the character Yin and Yang is based on, save for the Japanese version. Anyway, what happened to Shu Fu? Well, he never returned from his second voyage, and the most realistic explanation is that he either died or simply ran away to avoid answering for his failure. However, there are sources that speculate he reached the Japanese islands and was satisfied he had found his paradise there. And the Japanese name for this such paradise of Penlai? Horai. It's clear Jigokuraku used this version of events as the backbone for his world building. To be fair, Shu Fu is not the only inspiration for Shinsenkyo's master. Jigokuraku has been open about drawing inspiration from H.G. Wells' novel The Island of Dr. Moreau. And the similarities are there, an island where an ethically questionable scientist dedicated his life to strange experiments and creating hybrid chimera-like beings. Jofuku in Hell's Paradise is basically a fusion of the real-life historical Shu Fu with Wells' mad scientist. Now that we've finally reached the center stage of Hell's Paradise, the island of Shinsenkyo, it's time to look at some existential questions. And no, I'm not being pretentious, these really matter to the story. What is everything made of? And I don't mean in terms of atoms or matter, I mean what is underneath the physical world. Well, Hell's Paradise's story seems to give an answer to that. It's Tao. And before you jump to treating the concept as the basis for another battle shonen power system, I'm going to stop you for a moment and introduce you to ancient Chinese tradition and philosophy. The word Tao in and of itself means way, path, but in real-world Taoist usage it takes a much more profound meaning, the source of all existence. Don't think in terms of a tool or a substance or energy, it's not a force or nen or haki. Think of it more like a nameless, formless ground from which all things arise and all things return. The foundational text of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, has this to say about it. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Just an aside, the Tao Te Ching has many freely available translations and is easily accessible. You don't need to be a scholar to read it. Back to Taoist mythology, this would be the way it describes existence. From the Tao comes the One, the undifferentiated potential, and I know how we anime fans like to talk about potential. From the One comes the Two, what is usually referred to as Yin and Yang. From those two comes the Three, which is their interaction. From the Three comes the 10,000 things, meaning all existence. Taoist tradition believes that we human beings can return to the root, that underneath all the noise made by our personality, our culture, our desires, our inner self is already in harmony with the Tao. A Taoist practitioner isn't someone who tries to become something different. They are merely someone who seeks to stop being so many unnecessary things. This matches very well with how Hell's Paradise presents Tao. It flows through everything, but few can master it. We see this in how both Fuchi and Gantetsusai struggle with it. Their mind, for different reasons, is a way to focus on the tangible, on the empirical, on the 10,000 things. This direct quote from Hell's Paradise illustrates exactly this idea. The more you gain, the harder it is to take a good look at yourself. The more you shave away, the clearer things become. Of course, Taoism is also a religious system, not just a philosophical one, and so it has doctrine and traditions. I'm sure some of you have heard of the notion of Taoist cultivation, for example. So now, I'm going to go over a few key concepts and practices that are surely a basis of inspiration for Jigokuraku's world building. Let's start with Wu Wei, otherwise known as non-action or effortless action. This is the primary ethical concept of Taoism, and it is the means by which a practitioner is in harmony with Tao. Let's be clear though, this is not meant to be seen as passivity, but more of a way of acting in alignment with the natural flow of things, so without force or ego or anything artificial. If it seems that the practitioners in Hell's Paradise's island don't seem to respect this principle, that's probably intentional. The creator probably wanted to present Rien and Tensen as having perverted the original basis of Tao. Next concept, the three treasures. Taoist cultivation is, in a very simplified explanation, a way to practice the path that can lead to health, longevity, and eventual immortality. The Fangshi, someone like Shufu for example, were actually such cultivators. This practice believes that the human being is composed of three elements: the Jing, the essence, Qi, energy, and Shen, spirit. The path to immortality would require a cultivator to work with all of them, usually through breathing techniques, meditation, physical exercise, or even sexual cultivation. Now, this sounds more like what the Tensen were practicing, and I'll get to their specific practices in a bit. Before that, we need to mention the elixir fields, or the free energy centers in the body. The lower field, below the navel, the source of Jing, what in Hell's Paradise is called the Tanden. The middle, chest, seat of the Qi, and the upper, between the eyebrows, seat of Shen. This creates a perfect map of a Taoist cultivator's vital points. And it is from this tradition that our heroes draw the strategy for defeating the Tensen. Speaking of the body and its energies, another essential Taoist concept is Qi Monism. This is basically the idea that the body and the soul are not separate, unlike in most Western traditions. It creates a link between the individuals and the universe around, and allows for the idea that someone's physical and mental state are interconnected, that training the body and training the mind and soul go hand in hand. It's the basic idea needed before even contemplating the possibility of an immortal body. It's also why in Hell's Paradise, the character's state of mind is shown time and again, directly influencing their ability to access their Tao and fight. This ties in nicely to the next important concept, the Yin and Yang. Their symbol is a very popular one, even though it is often misunderstood. Yin and Yang are not supposed to be opposites. They complement each other and form a single whole, each containing the seed of the other, the small dot of opposite color inside each half. More importantly, they are not fixed, they transform. It's a beautiful metaphor for everything transforming given enough time and conditions. An ideal Taoist practitioner would need to balance both qualities and not be exclusively masculine or feminine. It's why Hell's Paradise's Tensen are androgynous, capable of switching between both genders. In this regard, they are almost ideal cultivators. In fact, in alchemical Taoism, the most advanced practitioners are said to have achieved the perfect union of yin and yang, something that was sometimes described through sexual metaphors. Bochujutsu, anyone? And finally, the last important Taoist concept I will cover, one central to Hell's Paradise's power system. Wuxing, the 5 phases, meaning wood, fire, earth, metal, water. In Taoist tradition, these are not static substances, but more agents of transformation through 2 primary cycles. Mutual generation, wood feeds fire, fire creates earth bears metal, metal liquefies to water, and water feeds wood. And from mutual overcoming. Water extinguishes fire, fire melts metal, metal cuts wood, wood breaks earth, earth dams water. Each of the 6 Tensen is associated with one of the 5 phases, plus the central earth element presided over by Rien. The correspondents are: Ran is water Tao, Zujin is also water Tao, Guifa metal Tao, Mudan earth Tao, Tao Fan Jufa wood and fire Tao, and Rien is earth as master center of it all. The enemy's combat logic uses the mutual overcoming cycle. Gantetsu's fire defeats Tao Fa's wood, Sagiri's wood Tao weakens Rien's earth, and so on. Because in this system, as in the real Taoist one, the body is not a machine that contains power. The body is the power, inseparable from the mind that directs it. And if there's any doubt that Rien and the Tensen are Taoist cultivators, let's look at the training methods they are said to use, because they borrow almost directly from Taoist practice. Ran engages in Douyin, physical exercise practice. In real Taoism, Douyin is an ancient system of therapeutic movement, stretching, breathing, and mindful movement to open the body's energy channels. Zujin presides over Taisoku, breathing technique. In real Taoism, Tai Chi, embryonic breathing, is a practice of refining breath to become progressively quieter, more inward, more efficient. Guifa trains in Shuitsu, meditation. In real Taoism, Shuyi, guarding the One, is a classical technique of maintaining unwavering awareness of the primordial unity, basically cultivating an undistracted presence. Mudan engages in Shuten, circulating energy through the body's internal pathways. In real Taoism, the microscopic orbit is used to circulate qi up the spine and down the front meridian, mapping the movements of heaven onto the body's interior landscape. And then there is Bochujutsu, employed by Tao Fa and Ju Fa. This one might tend some to raise their eyebrows, but it does resemble actual documented practice. The arts of the inner chamber was a recognized category of Taoist cultivation. Its principle was the exchange of Jing between partners, yin and yang essences meeting, strengthening each other, each practitioner benefiting from the other's vitality. It was not considered erotic entertainment, it was considered advanced medical and spiritual practice. Of course, Taoism is not the only religious inspiration for Hell's Paradise. In fact, Senta's character explicitly states that most of the island's imagery is a combination of Taoist and Buddhist traditions. So, let's now take a quick look at Buddhism and how it influenced the story. Buddhism originated sometime around the 5th century BC with the historical figure of Siddhartha Gautama, who most know as the Buddha, born a prince in what is now Nepal. And what he tried to teach the world begins with a very different question from the Tao's. Why do we suffer? The Buddha's core teaching, the Four Noble Truths, goes somewhat as follows. Suffering is real and pervasive, both obvious pain and also the subtle, persistent dissatisfaction that runs through ordinary life. Suffering comes from desires and attachment. We cling to things that change, resist things that are unavoidable, and exhaust ourselves in struggling between how things are and how we want them to be. But liberation from suffering is possible, and the means to that liberation is a path, called the Noble Eightfold Path. One of the core aspects of this path is called the Middle Way, and it is particularly relevant to our story because Hell's Paradise explicitly mentions it. We'll come back to the Middle Way in a moment, because it ties into some of the most beautiful character moments the story has to offer. 3 ideas are important to understanding Buddhism, and I mention these because they are also relevant to Hell's Paradise's themes. 1 is impermanence. Nothing that is conditional lasts. Everything you can point to is already changing. The second one is non-self. There is no fixed, permanent you underneath your experience. The third one, suffering, which arises in large part for clinging to a permanent self in an impermanent world. Buddhism developed, in some areas, a tradition called Pure Land. The belief that there is a place called the Land of Bliss where the conditions for achieving enlightenment are perfect. Where there is no suffering, no premature death, where everyone's need is met. The island in Hell's Paradise, Shinsenkyo, the land of the divine immortals, matches on the surface the Pure Land description very well. It is warm, beautiful, and full of things that look, from a distance, like gifts. But, well, we all know it is in fact a killing ground, a paradise that feeds on the people who reach it. The anime's very title, Jigokuraku, is a single word that merges Jigoku, which means hell, and Gokuraku, paradise, the word used specifically for the Buddhist Pure Land. Now, let's get back to that important principle I mentioned earlier, the middle way. The Buddha's first teaching after his enlightenment was that we needed to follow a path that avoids the extremes. The extreme of indulgence, losing yourself in pleasure, chasing satisfaction, and the extreme of self-punishment, denying every impulse, cultivating suffering as spiritual enlightenment. Neither of them lead to liberation. The middle way avoids both. The symbolic image for this in canon is the lute. If the strings are too tight, the lute cannot be played. If they're too loose, it cannot be played either. The right tension is what makes music possible. Hell's Paradise incorporates this concept into its power system. The anime is explicit about what activates Tao. When an individual manages to balance the spirit by following the middle way, Tao gets manifested. It's what Mei is trying to tell Gabimaru in one of his earlier fights in Season 1 by suggesting that he needs to also embrace weakness. It's why, when he loses his memories and reverts to his Gabimaru the Hollow persona, the strength of his Tao diminishes. You cannot access Tao from the extreme of overwhelming emotion. Terror, rage, grief, or love push to the point of consuming you. But you also cannot access it from the opposite extreme, from cold suppression, from the kind of blank emotion-free detachment that sounds like discipline but is actually just another kind of rigidity. Both extremes cut you off from the flow. Sagiri's character is the one who represents the middle way most clearly in the story. She has been trained from childhood in the samurai tradition, which values the appearance of emotional control. She arrives on the island trying to work from that extreme, suppress the fear, the doubt, function just through technical discipline. What she eventually discovers is that the strength she was looking for was never in suppression. It was in acceptance of all of her emotions, be it the fear, the uncertainty, the genuine compassion she has for the condemned prisoners she's supposed to be guarding, and holding all of it without being overwhelmed by it. One of her most memorable lines from the manga is, I think, this, and don't worry, it doesn't reference any specific plot points, so no spoilers. Do those without doubt even exist? And if they do, does that lack translate to strength? We struggle and doubt and struggle again. If abandoning such doubt is the way of the samurai, then samurai I am not, for I refuse to leave such things behind. To the bitter end, I remain nebulous and ill-defined, for that is who I am. Sagiri's position is in contrast with that of Shugen, but more importantly, to that of our antagonists. And for that argument, let me bring up one of the central images in Buddhist cosmology, the Wheel of Existence. It depicts the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, called samsara, as a wheel held in the grip of Yama, the Lord of Death, turning endlessly. At the center of the wheel are the three poisons: greed, hatred, and illusion, depicted as a pig, a snake, and a rooster, each biting the tail of the next, driving the turning. The Buddhists argue that what drives the wheel is simple: craving, attachment, and the refusal to accept impermanence. We cling to things, to people, to experiences, to our own sense of self, and because everything changes, everything eventually causes suffering. The only exit from this wheel is to release the desire for permanent things in an impermanent world. And if you think about it, nothing says permanence more than a quest to achieve immortality. The whole island's ecosystem is a representation of the samsara cycle itself. Human are turned into island plants, and their Tao is then turned into Tan, the pseudo-elixir meant to, once again, produce life. But because the resulting Tan is never enough, the whole process is repeated again and again. Rian describes it herself in a moment of self-reflection. Our worlds shall bloom, wither, be born again, and once more fall to ruin. The cycle goes on. Endlessly we return to the outset. This is basically the Buddhist diagnosis of suffering. The desire for permanence generates the very suffering it tries to escape. Hell's Paradise's island is what happens when someone refuses, with absolute determination, to accept impermanence. And I think that's the underlying theme of the story. The island's inhabitants had practiced and perfected the rituals, but had in fact abandoned the core principles of the traditions they were following. Something you see in real life as well, with many religious followers. Our heroes, the criminals and the outcasts of society, are the ones who rediscover, instinctually, the purer forms of these philosophies. Perhaps there's something there for everyone to think about.